So, there's an hour somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning where you can wake up for no reason at all and you know exactly what you're waiting for, right? You don't have to think about it, it's already there sitting on your chest, fully formed. It's a test result, or a visa, or a phone call, or a body that will either heal or it won't. It's a person who might come back, or an answer about whether you should keep hoping they will. It's a door you've knocked on so many times, you've started to feel a bit foolish for standing there. And in that hour, the waiting has a taste. It tastes slightly metallic. It's something that tastes like hell breath. Last time we talked about the horizon, that line where the sky stops being sky, the one that keeps its distance no matter how honestly you work towards it. And we asked what we're moving towards and what the moving asks of us. This one's harder, I think, because sometimes you're not moving at all. Sometimes you're just standing still on a piece of ground that you didn't choose. You're looking at that same line and nothing's approaching. The horizon isn't receding because you're walking, it's just sitting there, and you're just sitting here, and the days go by. And so the question that I've been carrying, the one I actually want to open up with you, is this. What does my waiting look like if I stop treating it as wasted time? It's not how to make waiting shorter, no. It's not, how to distract myself until the good part starts. But what I mean is, what if the waiting isn't the gap between two parts of my life? What if it's one of the parts? So this is Held Horizon, episode 2, where the sky meets waiting. Okay, so let me separate two things, because we use one word for both, and I think it causes real confusion. There's the waiting you choose, you planted something, or you applied for something, you started a degree, a pregnancy, a business, or a manuscript, and there is an end date to all of them, right? Roughly, there's an end date and you're walking towards it. So that kind of waiting has a specific, definite shape. It's tiring, sure, but it's legible, and you can tell people about it at a dinner table, and they nod and they understand. And then there's the other kind of waiting. It's the kind of waiting where you were handed, and nobody asked you to wait. There's no date, no end date, no deadline. There might not even be an outcome at all. You're wanting to know if you'll be a parent. You're waiting for a diagnosis or for the 6-month scan to come in. You're waiting for someone to become well enough to be reached. You're waiting for a country to let you in, or a court to decide, or grief to loosen its grip enough that you can breathe through your nose again. That second kind of waiting has no shape, and it's the one that makes people say the sentence that I want to spend this whole episode on. My life is on hold. And I said it. I've believed it. And I want to be gentle here, because that sentence usually comes from someone in real pain, and it deserves tenderness rather than correction. And also, I think that sentence does something to us, because when you say your life is on hold, you have quietly agreed that the months you're currently living don't count, that they're just a corridor. It's a corridor, something to get through with your eyes down so you can reach the room where your actual life is being kept. And if the corridor turns out to be 5 years long, then you've just spent 5 years of a life you only get one of, right? And it's as if you're agreeing not to be in it. You're agreeing not to live. And that agreement is what I want to loosen. Not the pain. The pain is allowed. Just that one agreement. Because I keep noticing something about horizons. The horizon isn't a place. It's a relationship between where you're standing and how far light travels. It only exists because you're standing somewhere, which means even now, even in the worst month, even flat on your back, you're producing a horizon. There's still a line out there where your sky meets your ground. So you're not outside your life waiting for it to resume. You're standing in it at the exact spot where the view is currently very hard. So why does waiting feel like a robbery? Viktor Frankl gave this a name that I've never really been able to shake. He called it provisional existence. And he was writing about concentration camps, about men who couldn't know how long they'd be there. And he noticed something quite specific. A prisoner who couldn't see an endpoint to his suffering began to lose his grip on the inner life. Frankl described it as being unable to aim at a future goal, and he watched what that did to people. They stopped living forward and they started living backwards in memory, letting the present become sort of unreal. And he tells a story in that book that I think about more than anything else I've read. A fellow prisoner, a composer, dreamt that the war would end for him on the 30th of March, right? And he was certain of that. He carried that date around with him, and he got better as it approached, hopeful and almost bright. And then on the 29th of March, he became ill, and on the 30th, he lost consciousness, and on the 31st, he died. So Frankl's reading of it was that the collapse of his hope collapsed his body's resistance with it. Now, I hold that story carefully because it's one man remembered by another man under extraordinary conditions, and I would never build a clinical claim around it. But as a picture of something, I think it's exact. When we hang the whole weight of our aliveness on a date, we hand that date a power it can't possibly hold. And most of us do a smaller version of this constantly. When the results come, when I hear back, when we move, when she's well, we put our life in a scroll. And the Quran has a line about a group of men who were left waiting, socially frozen, no answer coming, and the description of their state is one of the most physically accurate things I've read about this. It says the earth became constricted for them, vast as it is, and their souls became constricted for them. And that's the feeling, right? That's the world doesn't get smaller. It stays exactly as large as it was, and it closes in anyway. And so do you, right? So waiting compresses the space you have to stand in, and then it compresses the standing. So when we say waiting feels like waste, I think we mean something a bit more precise. It feels like being alive without being able to spend being alive, which is where I want to bring in a word that's been badly translated for about 400 years. In Arabic, the word is sabr, and it's usually handed to us in English as patience. And patience in English has picked up this passive, slightly saintly flavor. It's sitting still, not complaining, smiling with your teeth together, right? Go to the root though, and you get something else entirely. The root is sod ba ra, right? And its base sense is to bind, to restrain, to hold something fast so it doesn't scatter. It's the word you use for tying a thing down. So sabr isn't the absence of struggle. It's the act of holding your shape while something pulls at you. It's structural. It's a load-bearing word. Al-Ghazali, writing in the 11th century, gave it a whole book inside the Ihya, his book of patience and thankfulness. And he treats sabr as an activity of the soul. Something you do against a pull, not a mood you're supposed to have. And then there's the phrase that undid me a bit. It did that when I first sat with it properly. Sabr Jamil, beautiful patience. It comes from the story of Jacob, who loses his son, Yusuf, Prophet Joseph, and he's brought a shirt with false blood on it, and he says, beautiful patience. Now, if you only hold that line, you'd imagine a serene old man, composed, unbothered, fine. Except the story keeps going for years, and we're told what actually happens to him, right? He grieves so long and so hard that his eyes turn white with it, and he loses his sight from weeping. And later, when his family tell him he's making himself ill, that he should stop, he says something I find most unbearably tender. He says roughly, I complain of my anguish and my sorrow to God alone. So look at what beautiful patience actually contains. Years of it, tears until blindness, open grief, a man who never once pretend he's fine. The beauty isn't in the composure. The beauty is in the direction. He doesn't take his sorrow and pour it into bitterness or into blame or into the people around him, not even his sons. He takes it to God. And the grief goes somewhere rather than sobering where it stands. And that reframes the whole thing for me. Sabr never asked you to feel less. It asks you to stay bound, to keep your shape, to keep the address on the envelope, to stay grounded. And if you're someone who's been told, kindly or otherwise, that faith means you shouldn't be this sad about it, I'd offer you Yaqub. He wept himself blind, and the tradition still calls it beautiful. There's an episode in the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that speaks directly to the specific loneliness of an unanswered wait, right? Early on, after the revelation had begun, it stopped. There was an interval, and sources differ on how long, where nothing came. And the silence was long enough, and that it caused him real distress. And what came at the end of it was the Surah of the morning brightness, ad-Duha. It opens by swearing an oath by the morning light and by the night when it grows still. And then it says, "Your Lord has not forsaken you, and he is not displeased with you." So sit with that for a minute and sit with the structure of that. The reassurance arrives inside an oath sworn on the night. The stillness isn't apologized for, it's sworn by. It's held up as a witness alongside the light, as though the dark hours were also giving testimony. That's a very different theology of silence than the one most of us walk around with, right? Most of us hear silence and read it as verdict, as a no, as being skipped over. Ibn Atta'illah al-Iskandari, the 13th century Egyptian Sufi, he has an aphorism in the Hikam about this exactly. He writes, and I'm going to paraphrase slightly here, he writes that you shouldn't let the delay of a gift become a reason for despair, even when you've asked persistently, because the answer's been guaranteed in the form He chooses, He, Allah, God. He chooses rather than the form you choose, and at the time He wills rather than the time you will. So, two things in that are doing a lot of work, in the form He chooses and in the time He wills, which means an unanswered prayer might be an answered prayer you haven't recognized yet, either because it arrived in a shape you weren't looking for, or because it's still in transit. And there's a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim where the Prophet, peace be upon him, says a servant's supplication continues to be answered as long as he doesn't grow impatient. And then he's asked what impatient means, and he explains it as the one who says, I asked and I wasn't answered. And then he gives up asking. So understand that carefully, because it isn't scolding you for finding it hard. The impatience being described is very specific. It's the moment you conclude the line is dead and hang up. And there's also a well-known narration in Tirmidhi that waiting for relief is itself among the best acts of worship. Its grading has been discussed by scholars, with Al-Suyuti holding it authentic and others treating it more cautiously. So I want you to check that one against a source you trust before you build on it. But I mentioned it because of what it proposes, which is, honestly startling if you let it be. It's that the waiting itself is the act, not the preparation for the act, but it is the act, which would mean that the months you thought were empty may have been the most densely occupied months of your life. Okay, so now I want to bring in a distinction from a completely different tradition, because it says something the religious language sometimes assumes without spelling out. Heidegger, late in his life, wrote this strange little dialogue where three people walk on a country path and talk about thinking, right? And at one point, they arrive at a distinction between awaiting and waiting. So awaiting has an object. You're awaiting something specific, and you've already formed a picture of it, which means that you are really relating to your picture. Whereas waiting, the way he uses it, releases the object. You wait without holding a representation of what's coming. I find that difficult, and I find it also true, because most of my worst waiting has been a waiting. I wasn't waiting for the future. I was waiting for one specific version of the future that I'd already built in detail and, moved into emotionally. Simone Weil comes at the same territory from the other side. Her word is attente, which sits somewhere between waiting and attention. And she thought attention was the rarest and purest form of generosity. And then she went further, saying that attention, taken to its highest degree, becomes prayer. So in her hands, waiting turns into a kind of attending, being awake toward rather than pacing in front of. The Sufi tradition has its own version of this, and I think it's more embodied than any of them. So Al-Qushayri writes about two alternating states, qabd and bast. That's contraction and expansion. So times when the heart closes and times when it opens. And crucially, neither one is your achievement or your failure. They just arrive. They simply arrive. And waiting mostly happens in qabd, the closed season. So if you've been reading your contraction as evidence that you've fallen out of favor, that framework alone might change your year. And then there's the phrase the Sufis use for the one who's learned this: ibn al-waqt, the child of the moment, the son of the present time, someone who's stopped living in the tenses on either side of now, which sounds like a very serene thing to be. Except I'd point out that being the child of this moment, when this moment is a waiting room, is possibly the hardest form of it there is. So let me put some ground under all of this, because there's a body of research on waiting specifically. Kate Sweeney at UC Riverside has spent years studying people in real high-stakes waits. Law graduates waiting 4 months for bar exam results. Women waiting a week for biopsy results. And one of her early findings is, I think, one of the most validating things I can offer you. And we're bad at this. We are structurally bad. Her work suggests that the coping resources that we've developed for bad events don't really transfer to uncertainty. So when something bad happens, we've got machinery for it. While we're waiting to find out, that machinery mostly doesn't engage. Which means if you've been quietly grading yourself for handling this badly, you're being graded on a test that almost everyone fails. The interventions that showed something are worth knowing though. Mindfulness training during waiting periods produced encouraging results in her group's work. And absorbing activities, the kind that takes your whole attention rather than half of it, do more than ideal distraction does. And then there's one finding that I love, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like a bit of a gift for this particular episode. A study from her lab looked at awe, at the state of standing in front of something vast, and it found that awe eased the discomfort of waiting. So the sky, standing outside and looking up at a thing that has nothing to do with your outcome. The oldest advice in every tradition, and it appears to hold up under measurement. And two more quickly, because they are mechanically useful. Time perception research suggests that the more attentional resources you allocate to monitoring time, the longer a duration feels. So watching the clock literally manufactures more clock, right? And there's the wandering mind study, tracking people through their days, which found that mind wandering was associated with lower happiness, including, and this is the part that gets me, when the wandering was toward pleasant things. So put those together and you get something almost embarrassingly plain. The wait gets longer and heavier in direct proportion to how much of your attention you spend on the wait. And one last one. C.R. Snyder's work on hope defines it as two things working together. Agency, so the sense that you can move, and pathways, the ability to see more than one route. And what that tells me is that hope isn't optimism about the outcome. It's the felt availability of routes. So when a weight has flattened you, usually one of those two has gone missing, and it's worth knowing which. There's a scene in the Quran I keep returning to, and I want to give it to you here as a practical heart of all of these. Maryam is in labor, alone, and she's gone off by herself in pain, and she says out loud that she wishes she's died before this and been completely forgotten. That's in there, and that sentence is preserved in the scripture. And then she's told two things. She's told not to grieve and that there's a stream beneath her. And she's told to shake the trunk of the palm tree toward herself and ripe dates will fall. A woman in the last minutes of labor cannot shake a date palm. Anyone who stood next to one knows this. They are immovable, right? So the instruction is doing something other than logistics. The dates were coming. The provision was already decided. And still, she's asked to put her hands on the trunk and pull. That's my whole answer to the question I opened with. That's what waiting looks like when it stops being wasted. You put your hands on the trunk. You do the small, apparently futile, entirely non-decisive thing every day in the direction of the outcome you cannot cause. Not because your effort is what makes the date fall, but because the pulling is what keeps you a participant instead of a spectator in your own life. So practically, what does that actually look like? 1. Name what you're waiting for. Say the sentence out loud, and then ask the second question, which is what you're waiting for underneath that. Because often, the visa is standing in for safety. The results are standing in for permission to plan. The message from that person is standing in for being wanted. And when you find the second one, you'll often discover there are things you can do about it now, today, that have nothing to do with the outcome. 2. Build a meanwhile, an actual structure for the interval with its own integrity. Rilke told a young poet that everything is gestation and then birth, and that you have to let each impression complete itself in the dark, out of reach of your own understanding. And gestation isn't nothing happening. It's the most work a body ever does, entirely unwitnessed. 3. Give the grief an address. Jakob's example, right? Complain, yes, at full volume, and complain outward, in prayer, in journal, in a long walk where you say it out loud to nobody. Because what corrodes us is sorrow with nowhere to go, circling back into the same room. 4. Loosen the date. If you've hung your whole aliveness on the 30th of March, right, take some of that weight off. Not by hoping less, by hoping wider. Snyder's pathway, more than one route out. 5. Go outside and look up. Research says it, right? The tradition says it, and it costs nothing. 10 minutes with something vast that doesn't care about your outcome and won't be affected by it either way. And 6. Stop watching the clock. And I mean that in the literal mechanical sense. Every check reinflates the duration. The refreshing isn't neutral, and it's how you make the wait longer. Milton went blind in his 40s, and he wrote a sonnet about being unable to do the work he thought he'd been made for. And it ends with a line that took him a whole poem to earn. They also serve who only stands and wait. I used to hear that as consolation, second prize, the nice thing you say to the person on the bench. I don't hear it that way anymore. I hear it as a description of an actual occupation, standing in the form of service. Waiting is a posture that can be held well or held badly, generously or bitterly, awake or asleep. So back to where we started. That hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, I don't have a way to make it shorter. And if I did, I'd have used it on myself years ago. What I have is a shift in what I think is happening in it. The line where your sky meets your ground is still out there tonight. It's still out there, whether you're walking towards it or standing completely still. And it's out there in the hospital car park and the visa office and the room you can't sleep in. It's not waiting for you to start moving again in order to exist. You're not in a corridor, you're on the ground. The view is hard right now and the ground is still ground. Put your hands on the trunk. Thank you for sitting in this one with me. I know some of you are in the middle of a wait right now that you haven't told many people about. I hope this reached somewhere near it. Next time, we're going deeper into something that came up here and deserves its own hour. The difference between hope and expectation, and what it costs to want something without gripping it. Until then, be gentle with the season you're in.